Ever wonder why Putin and Kim are such good friends? We're going to trace how the friendship began all the way back. The story begins not in 2023, not even in the 21st century, but in the final days of World War II, when Soviet forces swept through Manchuria in August 1945. The Red Army's lightning offensive against Japanese forces in Korea resulted in Soviet troops occupying the northern half of the Korean peninsula above the 38th parallel, while American forces secured the south. This division, intended as a temporary administrative measure, would become one of the most fortified borders on Earth. In the northern zone, Soviet military authorities immediately began identifying and elevating Korean communists who had spent years in exile in the Soviet Union. Among them was a young guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung, who had fought against Japanese occupation forces in Manchuria during the 1930s and had received military training in the Soviet Union during World War II. By 1946, Soviet authorities had positioned Kim Il-sung as the leader of the Provisional People's Committee for North Korea. The Soviet occupation force, under the command of General Ivan Chistiakov, worked systematically to build a communist state in the north, nationalizing industries, redistributing land, and creating a political structure that mirrored Soviet institutions. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea was formally established on September 9, 1948, with Kim Il-sung as its premier. From the very beginning, North Korea existed as a Soviet client state, dependent on Moscow for economic aid, also military equipment, and political guidance. Soviet advisors permeated every level of the North Korean government and military. The relationship was not one of equals but of patron and protege, with Stalin maintaining firm control over strategic decisions. When Kim Il-sung began advocating for the reunification of Korea through military force, he required Stalin's approval. For months in 1949 and early 1950, Kim traveled to Moscow, pleading his case that the time was right to invade the South. Stalin initially resisted, fearing American intervention, but eventually gave his consent in the spring of 1950. Calculating that the United States would not risk a major war over Korea so soon after World War II. Stalin also insisted that Kim secure the support of Mao Zedong's newly established People's Republic of China, which Kim did during a visit to Beijing in May 1950. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a massive invasion that nearly succeeded in conquering the entire peninsula. Equipped with Soviet T-34 tanks, Soviet aircraft, and Soviet artillery, the Korean People's Army pushed South Korean and hastily deployed American forces into a small perimeter around Pusan. But Stalin had miscalculated. The United States, under President Harry Truman, secured a United Nations resolution authorizing military intervention. And General Douglas MacArthur's daring landing at Incheon in September 1950 reversed North Korea's fortunes almost overnight. By October, UN forces had driven deep into North Korea, approaching the Chinese border at the Yalu River. This prompted Mao Zedong to commit hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops to the war, saving Kim Il-sung's regime from complete destruction. The war stalemated roughly along the original border, and an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, though no peace treaty was ever concluded. The Korean War cost approximately 3 million lives and left the peninsula devastated. For North Korea, the war cemented several crucial realities. First, the regime's survival depended on external support from communist powers. Second, the United States was identified as the eternal enemy, the imperialist aggressor that had attempted to destroy the Korean Revolution. Third, only military strength and constant vigilance could guarantee the state's continued existence. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the Soviet Union poured resources into rebuilding North Korea. Soviet engineers designed and constructed factories, power plants, and infrastructure. Soviet military advisors trained the Korean People's Army. Soviet economic aid kept the North Korean economy functioning. During this period, North Korea actually achieved higher living standards and faster industrial growth than South Korea, which remained impoverished and politically unstable under a series of authoritarian governments. The relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang, however, was never simple or without tension. Kim Il-sung proved to be a skilled manipulator of great power rivalries. As the Sino-Soviet split deepened in the late 1950s and early 1960s, with Beijing and Moscow competing for leadership of the global communist movement, Kim positioned North Korea to extract maximum benefits from both sides. He would lean toward China when Soviet support seemed insufficient, then pivot back toward Moscow when Chinese aid proved inadequate. This balancing act allowed Kim to maintain North Korea's independence from complete domination by either communist giant, even as he remained dependent on both. The ideological foundation that Kim Il-sung developed, known as Juche, ostensibly emphasized self-reliance and Korean independence. Officially articulated in 1955, Juche was presented as a Korean adaptation of Marxism-Leninism, suited to Korea's specific historical conditions. In practice, Juche became the justification for Kim's absolute personal rule and the gradual transformation of North Korea from a Stalinist state into something resembling a hereditary monarchy with communist characteristics. By the 1970s, Kim had successfully eliminated all rival factions within the Workers' Party of Korea and had begun positioning his son, Kim Jong-il, as his successor. This dynastic element was virtually unprecedented in communist states and raised eyebrows in Moscow, where leadership succession followed different patterns. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union continued supporting North Korea throughout the 1970s and 1980s, viewing it as a crucial buffer state and a counterweight to American military presence in South Korea and Japan. The relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang during the Cold War was characterized by North Korea's strategic importance to Soviet interests in Northeast Asia. The Soviet Union maintained significant naval facilities in the region and viewed North Korea as part of a defensive perimeter against American power. Soviet military aid to North Korea remained substantial throughout the Cold War period. By the 1980s, North Korea possessed one of the largest standing armies in the world relative to its population, equipped almost entirely with Soviet-designed weapons, though increasingly these were produced in North Korean factories under license. The Soviet Union also provided crucial support for North Korea's nuclear program. Soviet scientists helped establish the Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center in the 1960s. Training North Korean scientists and providing a small research reactor. This cooperation was officially for peaceful purposes, but it gave North Korea the technical foundation for what would later become a weapons program. Everything changed in the late 1980s and early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. For North Korea, the dissolution of the USSR was nothing short of catastrophic. The new Russian Federation, under Boris Yeltsin, pursued radically different foreign policies. Yeltsin sought integration with the West, normalized relations with South Korea in 1990, and dramatically reduced aid to North Korea. The subsidized trade relationships that had sustained the North Korean economy disappeared virtually overnight. North Korea had been receiving Soviet oil at friendship prices far below market rates. This ended. Soviet technical advisors departed. The flow of spare parts for Soviet-designed machinery stopped. The economic impact on North Korea was devastating. The country entered what became known as the Arduous March. a period of economic collapse and famine in the mid-1990s that killed an estimated 200,000 to 3 million people, though exact figures remain disputed due to the regime's secrecy. Kim Il-sung died in 1994, and his son Kim Jong-il assumed power during this period of unprecedented crisis. The younger Kim faced a situation his father had never encountered. North Korea was essentially alone. China provided some assistance, but Beijing was opening to the world and developing economic ties with South Korea. Russia under Yeltsin was indifferent at best and occasionally hostile. The United States was the sole remaining superpower and was pressuring North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons program. In this context, Kim Jong-il made a strategic decision that would define North Korea's trajectory for the next 3 decades. He determined that only nuclear weapons could guarantee the regime's survival. The nuclear program became the absolute priority, regardless of international sanctions or economic cost. In 1993, North Korea announced its withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, despite various agreements and negotiations, North Korea steadily advanced its nuclear capabilities. The first nuclear test occurred in October 2006, a relatively small explosion that nonetheless demonstrated North Korea had crossed the nuclear threshold. During this period, Russian-North Korean relations remained cool, but never completely severed. Russia maintained its embassy in Pyongyang, and some trade continued, but the relationship lacked the depth and strategic coordination of the Soviet era. This began to change with Vladimir Putin's rise to power. Putin, who became acting president of Russia on December 31, 1999, and was elected president in March 2000, brought a fundamentally different worldview than Yeltsin. Putin was a former KGB officer who viewed the collapse of the Soviet Union as, in his own words, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He was determined to restore Russia's status as a great power and to push back against what he perceived as American unilateralism and NATO expansion. In this context, relationships with states that opposed American hegemony gained new importance. Putin made his first visit to North Korea in July 2000, becoming the first Russian leader to visit Pyongyang. He met with Kim Jong-il, and the two leaders signed a declaration pledging to strengthen bilateral ties. The visit was symbolic, signaling that Russia was returning to the region as a player and that North Korea would not be abandoned. However, during the early 2000s, Putin still maintained a relatively balanced approach, supporting international efforts to denuclearize North Korea through the six-party talks that included North Korea, South Korea, China, Japan, Russia, and the United States. Russia's relationship with North Korea during this period was correct, but not especially close. Putin was still attempting to maintain constructive relations with the West, and Russia's foreign policy had not yet fully pivoted to confrontation with the United States. The turning point came gradually through the 2010 as Russia's relationship with the West deteriorated. The 2008 war with Georgia, disputes over NATO expansion, the 2014 annexation of Crimea and intervention in eastern Ukraine, and the subsequent Western sanctions all pushed Russia toward a more confrontational stance. In this evolving geopolitical landscape, North Korea's value to Russia increased. North Korea represented a state that had successfully defied American pressure for decades, that had developed nuclear weapons despite international opposition, and that tied down American military resources in Northeast Asia. As Russia found itself increasingly isolated from Western economies and institutions, alternative partnerships became more attractive. North Korea, despite its poverty and international pariah status, possessed certain assets that Russia found useful: a large military, a strategic location, and a willingness to cooperate with Moscow against shared adversaries. Kim Jong-un came to power in December 2011 following his father's death. The youngest son of Kim Jong-il, educated partially in Switzerland, Kim Jong-un initially appeared to some observers as potentially more reform-minded than his predecessors. These hopes quickly proved illusory. Kim Jong-un consolidated power through a brutal purge of potential rivals, including the execution of his uncle Yang Song-thaek in 2013, and dramatically accelerated North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. Under Kim Jong-un's leadership, North Korea conducted 4 nuclear tests between 2013 and 2017, each more powerful than the last. The regime also made dramatic progress in missile technology, testing intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the United States mainland. By 2017, North Korea claimed to have developed a hydrogen bomb and demonstrated missiles that could strike American cities. This period of heightened tensions, with President Donald Trump threatening fire and fury, and Kim Jong-un conducting increasingly provocative tests, paradoxically set the stage for the current Russian-North Korean relationship. The international sanctions imposed on North Korea became increasingly comprehensive, targeting the country's already limited trade relationships and cutting off most legal avenues for foreign currency. North Korea became one of the most heavily sanctioned nations on Earth, facing restrictions comparable to those later imposed on Russia following its 2022 invasion of Ukraine. This shared experience of comprehensive Western sanctions created a foundation for deeper Russian-North Korean cooperation. Both nations found themselves cut off from the global financial system, unable to use SWIFT banking networks, and targeted by secondary sanctions that punished third parties for doing business with them. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 transformed the geopolitical landscape and elevated North Korea's importance to Moscow. The war in Ukraine proved far more costly and protracted than Russian planners had anticipated. Russian forces consumed ammunition at rates that strained domestic production capacity. Western sanctions limited Russia's ability to import components for weapons manufacturing. Russian casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. In this context, North Korea emerged as one of the few countries willing and able to provide Russia with military supplies. North Korea possessed vast stockpiles of Soviet-era compatible ammunition and weapons, including millions of artillery shells in calibers that Russian forces used. North Korea's defense industry, while technologically dated, was capable of producing large quantities of munitions. Crucially, North Korea had no qualms about violating international sanctions or concerns about Western disapproval. Intelligence assessments from South Korea, the United States, and other countries began documenting substantial North Korean arms shipments to Russia starting in 2022 and accelerating through 2023. Reports indicated that North Korea had shipped thousands of containers of munitions to Russia, including artillery shells, rockets, and possibly ballistic missiles. In September 2023, Kim Jong-un undertook his first foreign trip in over 4 years, traveling by armored train to Russia's Far East. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. Kim's train journey echoed his grandfather's 1949 visit to Moscow, when Kim Il-sung had traveled by train to meet Stalin and secure support for North Korean independence and development. The meeting between Putin and Kim at the Vostochny Cosmodrome was carefully choreographed. Putin personally guided Kim through the rocket facilities, and the two leaders discussed space cooperation, satellite technology, and military assistance. The message was clear. Russia and North Korea were deepening their strategic partnership in defiance of Western pressure. What does North Korea gain from this relationship? The benefits are substantial and multifaceted. First and most immediately, North Korea receives hard currency and resources in exchange for weapons shipments. For a country as economically isolated as North Korea, any source of foreign exchange is valuable. Second, North Korea gains access to Russian technology and expertise. Russia possesses advanced capabilities in space technology, satellite systems, submarine technology, and nuclear propulsion that North Korea seeks. Reports following the September 2023 summit suggested that Russia might provide assistance with North Korea's satellite program. North Korea had attempted several satellite launches with limited success, and Russian expertise could significantly advance these efforts. Indeed, in November 2023, North Korea successfully placed a military reconnaissance satellite into orbit, likely with Russian technical assistance. Third, North Korea benefits from Russian diplomatic support. Russia, as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council with veto power, can block additional sanctions or other punitive measures against North Korea. In March 2024, Russia vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that would have extended the mandate of the panel of experts monitoring sanctions enforcement against North Korea, effectively crippling international oversight of sanctions violations. For Russia, the partnership with North Korea serves multiple strategic purposes beyond immediate military supplies. North Korea's willingness to provide weapons and ammunition helps sustain Russia's war effort in Ukraine at a time when Russian defense production struggles to meet demand. The relationship demonstrates that Russia is not internationally isolated, that it can build alternative partnerships outside the Western-dominated order. North Korea's location in Northeast Asia is strategically valuable, providing Russia with a partner that complicates American military planning in the region. If the United States becomes more deeply involved in supporting Ukraine or faces a crisis over Taiwan, North Korea's presence on the Korean peninsula ties down American forces and attention. Additionally, the Russian-North Korean partnership strengthens Russia's hand in its broader competition with the United States by demonstrating that American sanctions and pressure can be circumvented through cooperation among sanctioned states. The historical parallels are striking and intentional. The current Russian-North Korean relationship deliberately evokes the Soviet-North Korean alliance of the Cold War era. Both Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin are acutely conscious of history and use historical symbolism to legitimize their actions. Kim Jong-un has cultivated an image that recalls his grandfather Kim Il-sung rather than his father, emphasizing the founding era of North Korea when Soviet support was crucial. Putin frequently references the Soviet Union's victory in World War II and presents himself as restoring Russia's rightful place as a great power. The September 2023 meeting was framed by both sides in terms that echoed Cold War alliances, with references to traditional friendship and mutual support against imperialism. This is not mere rhetoric, but reflects a genuine ideological affinity. Both leaders view themselves as standing against American hegemony, defending their nation's sovereignty against Western interference, and building an alternative international order. The relationship also reflects deeper structural factors in contemporary international relations. The post-Cold War period of American unipolarity is clearly ending. The international system is becoming more multipolar, with multiple centers of power and competing visions of world order. In this environment, states that find themselves at odds with the United States and its allies are naturally drawn together, forming partnerships based on shared opposition rather than shared ideology. Russia and North Korea do not share a common political system in the way that the Soviet Union and North Korea did. Putin's Russia is not communist, but rather a hybrid authoritarian system combining elements of nationalism, Orthodox Christianity, and state capitalism. North Korea's system is unique, a totalitarian hereditary dictatorship with communist trappings. What unites them is not ideology, but geopolitics. Both face comprehensive Western sanctions. Both are excluded from Western-dominated international institutions. Both view the United States as an existential threat, and both benefit from cooperation that helps them resist Western pressure. The implications of this deepening partnership are significant and troubling. The transfer of North Korean weapons to Russia prolongs the war in Ukraine, contributing to continued casualties and destruction. The provision of Russian technology to North Korea advances North Korean military capabilities, including potentially its nuclear and missile programs, making the Korean peninsula more dangerous. The erosion of the international sanctions regime against North Korea undermines decades of international efforts to pressure the regime to denuclearize. The partnership between two heavily sanctioned states demonstrates the limits of sanctions as a policy tool and may encourage other states to believe they can violate international norms with impunity if they can find alternative partners. The Russian-North Korean relationship also complicates the strategic environment in Northeast Asia, potentially triggering responses from South Korea, Japan, and the United States that could lead to regional arms races or miscalculation. Looking at this relationship through the lens of history, we see patterns repeating across decades. The fundamental dynamic established in 1945, when Soviet forces occupied northern Korea and began building a client state, continues to shape events today. North Korea has always depended on external support for its survival, first from the Soviet Union, then from a combination of Chinese and limited Russian aid, and now increasingly from Russia again. The strategic logic that made North Korea valuable to the Soviet Union during the Cold War operates again today. North Korea occupies strategic territory, ties down American resources, and provides a partner willing to take actions that support Russian interests. The personal relationships between leaders matter as well. Kim Il-sung's relationship with Stalin, though unequal, was crucial to North Korea's founding. Kim Jong-un's relationship with Putin, while different in character, serves similar functions of providing legitimacy and material support. The friendship between Putin and Kim Jong-un is not based on personal affection or shared hobbies. It is a calculated strategic partnership between two authoritarian leaders who find their interests aligned against a common adversary. They are good friends because they need each other. Russia needs North Korea's weapons and its willingness to defy international sanctions. North Korea needs Russia's resources, technology, and diplomatic protection. Both need to demonstrate that they are not isolated, that they can build alternative partnerships, and that Western pressure will not force them to change course. This partnership is rooted in the deep history of Soviet involvement in Korea, sustained by decades of Cold War alliance, renewed by the shared experience of international isolation, and strengthened by active military cooperation in Russia's war against Ukraine. Understanding why Putin and Kim Jong-un are such good friends requires understanding not just current events, but the entire sweep of 20th and 21st century history: the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, the Korean War, the Cold War, the post-Cold War period, and the current emergence of a new era of great power competition. The embrace between these two leaders at Vostochny Cosmodrome in September 2023 was not an aberration, but the logical culmination of historical forces set in motion 8 decades ago on the Korean peninsula, when Soviet soldiers first crossed the 38th parallel and began building the state that Kim Jong-un now rules and that Vladimir Putin now courts as an essential partner in his confrontation with the West.